The letter arrived on a cold Tuesday morning, its envelope stark against the usual white of the mailbox. It was unmarked, no return address, just a dark crimson wax seal holding it shut. Eric's Vale stood there, his heart racing in his chest, staring at the odd envelope. It felt like it had been waiting for him. The weight of it was almost suffocating, and his fingers trembled as he tore it open. Inside was a single sheet of thick paper, folded in half. There were no names, no dates, only a cryptic message written in a jagged, almost unnatural script. Follow the rules, and you'll see the truth. Disobey, and you will never leave. The sentence hung in the air, its meaning unclear yet unnervingly direct. Below it, a list of simple instructions followed. 1. Pack only what you can carry in one bag. 2. Do not speak unless spoken to. 3. Follow all directions without question. 4. If you break any rule, you will never leave. There was no signature, no hint of who this invitation was from. But something deep within Eric stirred, a mixture of curiosity, fear, and excitement. He had always sought the unknown, the unexplained. His entire life had been one big question mark, and this invitation, it promised answers. The truth. Whatever that truth was, it felt both terrifying and irresistible. The next morning, despite every warning his mind screamed at him, Eric's packed a small, simple bag. He followed the instructions to the letter, leaving behind his phone, his wallet, anything that would tie him to the world he knew. He couldn't explain why, but something in him knew he had to go. It was as if the invitation had been made for him, and if he ignored it, he would regret it forever. So he boarded the flight, heading to a location marked only by coordinates that were included with the letter. As the plane soared through the air, Eric's couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The flight attendants moved in eerie silence, their expressions blank, almost robotic. They didn't speak, didn't smile, nothing. Just the quiet click of their shoes against the floor as they went about their duties. The passengers around him were just as strange, each one locked in their own world, as if they were waiting for something. A sudden chill ran through Eric's spine, and he glanced out of the window, his eyes searching for some sign of where they were. But all he could see was a dense, endless ocean of clouds. He couldn't help but feel that the world beneath him didn't belong to him, that it wasn't his world anymore. As the hours passed, the plane seemed to stretch out time itself. Every minute felt like an eternity. No one spoke. There were no announcements from the pilot. It was as if they were all trapped in a dream. The air around him felt thick, heavy. His thoughts raced. Had he made a mistake? Should he have ignored the invitation? But by now, it was too late. There was no turning back. He was already halfway there. The plane finally began its descent, and Eric's stomach dropped. Looking out the window, he saw nothing but dense, dark forests stretching as far as the eye could see. There were no cities, no signs of civilization, just the wilderness. The landing was smooth, almost unnaturally so, and the plane came to a stop at an isolated airstrip surrounded by tall, looming trees. No other planes were in sight. No one was there to greet them. As the doors of the plane opened, the cold air hit him like a physical force. Eric stepped out, feeling the ground beneath him, but everything felt off. The air was too still, the silence too deep. He followed the other passengers down the steps, all of them walking in eerie unison, not a word spoken. His eyes darted around, searching for any sign of life, but there was nothing. Just the faint hum of distant machinery and the endless trees. And then, out of nowhere, a figure emerged from the shadows. Dr. Thalrix Vorn. His tall frame and sharp features seemed to cut through the air as he approached Eric's with a cold, almost clinical gaze. He was dressed in a dark suit, his posture rigid and precise. There was something unsettlingly perfect about him, as though he was not quite human. His voice, when he spoke, was calm and emotionless, almost robotic. "Eric's Vale, welcome," Dr. Vorn said, his eyes scanning him with an almost predatory precision. "I trust you've read the rules. You will follow them, won't you?" The words hit Eric's like a slap to the face, and for a moment he froze. He couldn't speak. His mouth was dry, his heart pounding. This man, this creature, seemed to know everything about him. It was as if the invitation had been meant for him alone, like the outpost had been waiting for him. The truth, the answers he had longed for, were now right in front of him. Dr. Vorn's eyes bored into his, and Eric's felt an unsettling chill crawl up his spine. He had to say something. He had to speak, but his voice betrayed him. All he could do was nod. It was the only thing he could do. His head felt heavy, like it was filled with a fog he couldn't clear. Good, Dr. Vorn said, almost approvingly. You will follow the rules. Failure to do so will result in consequences you cannot begin to comprehend. Eric's mind was racing, his body fighting against the overwhelming sense of unease that gripped him. But he was already here, already too far in. There was no going back. Dr. Vorn led him to the outpost, and as the doors to the facility closed behind them, Eric's couldn't shake the feeling that he had just crossed a line, one that could never be uncrossed. The air inside was cold, too cold, and the walls seemed to hum with an energy that made his skin crawl. Dr. Vorn walked ahead of him, his footsteps echoing in the vast emptiness of the hall. The silence here was different. It wasn't just quiet, it was suffocating. You will follow every rule, Eric's, Dr. Vorn said, his voice low and ominous. Speak only when spoken to. Follow the instructions precisely. Fail, and you will never leave this place. Eric's heart skipped a beat as the words sank in. It wasn't just a warning. It was a promise, a terrifying promise. As Dr. Vorn walked ahead, his final words sent a cold shiver down Eric's spine. You are never truly alone here. The door to the outpost shut behind them with a sound that seemed to reverberate deep into the earth itself. The world outside had been swallowed by darkness, and Eric's could feel the weight of the isolation pressing in on him. There was no way out. The silence inside the outpost was unbearable. It wasn't the kind of silence that calmed the mind, but one that pressed in on you, making each breath feel heavier than the last. The walls were unnaturally white, almost blinding, and the air carried a faint, sterile scent that lingered in Eric's nostrils like something used to disinfect the very soul. Everything felt too clean, too perfect, as though no one had ever stepped out of place. As he walked down the long, empty hallways, the only sounds were the soft click of his boots against the floor and the occasional hum of distant machinery. It wasn't a soothing hum, it was unsettling, like a constant reminder that something was always working just beyond his reach. Zyra Kalm, the security officer, walked ahead of him without a word, her back straight, her eyes trained forward. She was tall, with dark hair tied back in a severe bun, her uniform crisp and impeccably neat. Her presence was unnerving in its stillness, and Eric's couldn't help but feel that she wasn't just watching the hallways. She was watching him. Her gaze, though impassive, was always a fraction of a second too slow when it flicked back to him. Eric's didn't need to be told. The message was clear. Do not deviate. Do not ask questions. Follow the rules. They passed doors on either side, most of them closed, with no indication of what lay behind them. The occasional sound of a door opening and closing sent a chill down his spine. He couldn't shake the feeling that the entire facility was a machine, each part operating in perfect synchronization, but with no room for anything human. They stopped in front of one door, its number scrawled hastily in black marker, 3B. Zyra opened it without a sound, stepping aside to let him in. Eric's entered, his eyes scanning the small, sparse room. It was nothing more than a cot, a desk, and a metal chair. No windows, no personal touches. The walls, like everything else, were stark white. The bed looked uncomfortable, the kind of thing designed to make you feel like you weren't supposed to rest. It was as if the entire place was built to keep you alert, aware, but never at peace. Before he could speak, Zyra gave him a final, silent nod and left, the door clicking shut behind her. Eric stood there for a moment, unsure of what to do. The silence of the room pressed down on him like a weight, making every movement feel too loud. He walked over to the small desk, where a single note was placed in the center. It was the same jagged handwriting from the letter he had received. The words on it were simple but cold. Stay in your room until you are called. Do not leave. Do not speak. Eric shuddered as he folded the note, his mind racing with questions he was too afraid to ask. There had to be some explanation. There had to be a reason why everything felt so wrong. He didn't know how long he sat there, but at some point, the faintest sound from the hall caught his attention. A soft scraping noise, like the sound of shoes dragging on the floor. His heart skipped, and he froze listening. The sound came closer, then stopped. His breath caught in his throat as the door creaked open, and in stepped someone he had not seen before, Raylan Thorne. Raylan was disheveled, his hair unkempt, and his eyes wide with a frantic look that immediately made Eric's feel uncomfortable. He didn't walk into the room. He stumbled, like he was unsure whether to step inside or run away. When their eyes met, Eric's could see the fear, the panic, in Raylan's gaze. "You're new." Raylan's voice was hoarse, barely a whisper. He didn't wait for a response. "Don't trust them. Don't trust anything here. Eric's blinked in confusion, but before he could respond, Raylan quickly stepped closer, lowering his voice. They're watching us. They're watching everything we do. You don't know what they're doing to us. What they'll do if you break any of their rules. The words hit Eric's like a jolt, sending a shiver up his spine. But Raylan didn't wait for a response either. He spun on his heel and left the room, disappearing down the hall without another word, his footsteps fading into the eerie quiet. Eric stood there, speechless, his mind racing. What had just happened? Who were these people? Why were they so scared? Suddenly, there was a knock at the door. Eric's pulse quickened, his heart pounding in his chest. He didn't know if he should open it. But the knock came again, gentler this time, but insistent. With trembling hands, he grabbed the handle and pulled the door open. Zyra stood in the doorway, her expression as unreadable as ever. Without speaking, she motioned for him to follow her. Eric's hesitated, his eyes flicking to the empty hall, the silence pressing in on him from all sides. What was happening here? Where was Raylan? Was he telling the truth? The questions gnawed at him, but he knew he had no choice but to comply. He followed Zyra through the same long, sterile hallways, every step echoing unervingly loud in the oppressive silence. This time, however, there was a new presence in the air, something thick, something suffocating. It wasn't just the sterile atmosphere. It felt like something was hiding, something watching him from the shadows. They passed another door, and as they did, Eric's caught a glimpse of something. A figure. Alara Kethrin. She stood motionless in the corner, her eyes wide and hollow, staring at nothing. She looked almost vacant. Her lips were parted, but she wasn't speaking, wasn't moving. It was as if she were trapped in her own mind, locked away somewhere far beyond reach. Eric's stomach churned at the sight of her, but Zyra continued walking, unaware, or maybe uncaring, of the woman's unsettling state. Zyra stopped at a door near the far end of the hall and turned to Eric's. You'll stay here for the night. Tomorrow, you'll meet Dr. Vorn. He will explain your role here. Until then, do not leave this room. Do not speak. Eric's heart beat faster as he took in her words. He was afraid to ask any more questions. Instead, he simply nodded, stepping inside the room she indicated. The door closed behind him with a quiet click, and the faint scraping noise of footsteps echoed in the distance. The room felt colder than before, the silence thicker. Eric's mind raced. What was really going on here? What had Raylan meant? And why was Alara so empty? He didn't know the answers, but he felt deep in his gut that the Outpost wasn't just a place for research. It was a place for something far darker, something beyond human understanding. And then, just as the cold seemed to settle into his bones, the lights flickered above him. Once, twice. He looked up, a jolt of fear running through him as he waited for them to go out entirely. But instead they dimmed, and a shadow moved across the far wall. Eric's breath caught in his throat as he turned slowly, his eyes searching the darkened corners of the room. But there was nothing. Still, the feeling of being watched didn't leave. The silence grew even more suffocating. And outside the door, the guards stood motionless, their faces as vacant as the empty halls. Eric's was trapped. The air inside the lab was thick with the acrid scent of chemicals and something else, something metallic, like the taste of blood. Eric's felt his stomach churn as he walked deeper into the sterile room, following Kavrin Isso, the alien researcher. Kavrin moved with unnerving calmness, his eyes never meeting Eric's as he led him through rows of equipment, all designed for something that Eric's couldn't quite grasp. But there was something more terrifying than the machines themselves. It was the purpose behind them. They stopped in front of a large, reinforced glass chamber. Inside was a figure, suspended in some sort of fluid, wires and tubes feeding into its body. At first glance, it appeared human, just a man, floating eerily still in the liquid, his features indistinct under the murky surface. But as Eric's eyes adjusted, he noticed the differences. The skin was too pale, too smooth, and there were subtle, almost imperceptible lines tracing along the arms, like veins that didn't belong to any human body he'd ever seen. It was unnerving to look at, as if the body didn't quite fit the world around it. This is Varys Nor. Kavrin's voice cut through the silence, his tone cold, clinical. He's the result of years of research. A hybrid, part human, part alien. Eric's stomach twisted. He took a step closer, drawn by a strange, sick curiosity. Varys' eyes were closed, but even in his unconscious state, there was something about the way he hovered in the fluid, something that made Eric's skin crawl. It was as though the being was aware, somehow, even in its suspended state. He could almost feel the weight of its gaze pressing against him, though there was no way the creature could be watching him. The goal, Cavern continued, is to create new beings capable of surviving in both human and alien environments. Adaptable, resilient, and eventually capable of more than we could ever imagine. He paused for a moment, as if considering his words. We are only beginning to understand the potential of these hybrids. Eric's wasn't sure whether it was the coldness in Cavern's voice or the sheer wrongness of what he was seeing, but a feeling of dread settled over him like a dark cloud. The whole idea seemed monstrous. These hybrids, they weren't human anymore, were they? Not fully. What had they become? As if sensing his unease, Cavern turned and led Eric's further into the lab, where more chambers lined the walls. Each one contained another figure, each one more grotesque than the last. Some were small, almost childlike in their proportions, others large, towering over Eric's head. But all shared the same haunting feature. Eyes that looked too aware for creatures that were supposed to be in some sort of suspended state. They weren't just in these tanks, they were watching, waiting. Why are they like this? Eric's couldn't stop himself from asking. The words slipped out before he could think better of it. Cavern didn't answer at first. Instead, he moved to one of the tanks and tapped a few buttons on a nearby console. The fluid inside the tank began to swirl, and a soft hum filled the room. The creature inside, a hulking figure with skin stretched too tightly over its bones, began to stir. Eric's breath caught in his throat as the figure opened its eyes, pale, milky white eyes without pupils, and locked them onto him. It was as though the thing had been waiting for him to see it. They are part of the experiment, Cavern finally spoke, his voice taking on a distant quality. We push the boundaries of what is possible, to create something new, something stronger. But the way he spoke, the cold detachment in his voice, it unsettled Eric's even more. These creatures were not subjects, they were tools. Tools being shaped and reshaped until they became something unrecognizable. And yet, Eric's couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more. Something about these hybrids wasn't just wrong in their creation. It felt like they were wrong in their existence. The door to the lab creaked open, and Eric's turned, instinctively taking a step back. Raylan Thorne stood in the doorway, his face pale, his hands shaking. There was something off about him, something that had changed since the last time Eric's had seen him. His eyes were wide, as if he were seeing things that weren't there, and his breath came in shallow gasps. Do you see it? Raylan's voice was strained, as though speaking was taking all his energy. Eric's confusion deepened. See what? Raylan's gaze flicked to the tanks, and then back to Eric's. They're watching us. All of them. His voice trembled, his words hanging in the air like a warning. They know we're here. They know everything. Eric's felt a chill run down his spine. What are you talking about? Raylan stepped closer, his eyes darting around the lab as if expecting someone, or something, to appear. I overheard them, he whispered, his voice barely audible. The hybrids, they're not just experiments. They're alive in ways we don't understand. They know what's happening. They know what we're doing to them. Eric's heart pounded in his chest. He didn't know whether Raylan was completely losing his mind or if there was some terrifying truth to his words. But before he could ask any more questions, a loud crash echoed through the lab, and Eric spun around, his eyes wide in panic. The hybrids, some of them, were moving. Slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, but the fluid inside the tanks began to churn violently, as if the creatures inside were struggling to break free. Raylan staggered back, his eyes wild. They're coming. They're coming for us. A low rumble vibrated through the building, shaking the walls. Eric's felt the ground beneath his feet tremble, and the lights above flickered ominously. Panic surged through him as alarms began to blare, cutting through the chaos. Your cooperation is required, a cold, mechanical voice echoed over the intercom, sending a chill through Eric's bones. Failure to comply will have irreversible consequences. The sound of the intercom buzzed in his ears, drowning out the frantic movement in the lab. The hybrids in their tanks were no longer still. They were thrashing, slamming their fists against the glass, their eyes wide and filled with something that could only be described as fury. Raylan grabbed Eric's by the arm, pulling him toward the door. We have to get out of here. Now. But before they could reach the exit, the door slammed shut with a deafening crash, trapping them inside. Eric's breath caught in his throat as he turned back to face the chaos unfolding before him. The hybrids were waking up, and Eric's had a terrible, gut-wrenching feeling that they were no longer just experiments. They were something much worse. Something that wanted to escape. Something that wanted to get out. And the worst part, they were looking right at him. The days in the outpost began to blur together, a fog of confusion and fear closing in on Eric's. The walls felt alive, pulsing with a strange energy that thrummed just beneath the surface. He could feel it in his bones, in the air he breathed. It was as if the building itself was breathing, watching, and waiting. The harsh, sterile environment that had once felt so clinical now felt suffocating, oppressive. It was like being trapped inside a living, breathing thing, and Eric's couldn't shake the feeling that it was closing in on him. His skin crawled, his mind teetering on the edge of something terrible, something beyond his control. At night, the nightmares came. They were vivid, too real to be dreams, too twisted to be memories. In the darkness of his room, he could hear whispers, soft, almost inaudible, like the wind brushing through the cracks in the walls. Sometimes, he swore he saw figures standing just out of sight, their shadows stretching and contorting in unnatural ways. He tried to ignore it, to shake off the fear, but it was impossible. The whispers grew louder each night, more distinct, more personal. They weren't just in his head, they were everywhere. The hybrids were changing too. Varys Nor, the hybrid Eric's had seen in the lab, was growing stronger, more aware. At first, it was subtle, a flicker of movement in his eyes, an almost imperceptible twitch of his fingers. But soon, Varys was no longer just a subject in a tank. He was awake, and he was watching. Eric's could feel the hybrid's gaze, even when he wasn't looking directly at him. It was as though Varys could see into his soul, reading his every thought before Eric's even knew it. The hybrid's eyes, those empty, milky white eyes, seemed to follow him wherever he went, and Eric's couldn't escape the feeling that Varys was speaking to him without saying a word. It started with a thought that wasn't his own, a voice that echoed in the back of his mind. "You are not alone," it whispered, a voice as cold and unfeeling as the metal walls surrounding him. "You never have been." Eric's recoiled, his heart pounding in his chest. He wasn't sure if it was real, if he was losing his mind, or if something far darker was at work. But the more he tried to ignore it, the louder the whispers became. Soon, they weren't just in his mind, they were in the air, filling the empty spaces of the outpost. The other hybrids, those in their tanks, those moving slowly through the halls, were all connected somehow, feeding into this growing presence. The line between reality and nightmare was blurring, and Eric's couldn't trust his own senses anymore. As the days dragged on, the tension in the outpost grew. The staff seemed to move even more deliberately, their actions too calculated, too perfect. Zyra Calm, the stoic security officer, was always watching, always present, her eyes following Eric's every move. He could feel her gaze on him, even when he wasn't looking. He started to doubt everything. What was real? What was a dream? And most terrifying of all, was he a part of this experiment? Was his mind already being twisted by forces he couldn't comprehend? The turning point came when Talonjin, one of the researchers, approached him in secret. He had been quiet for days, his face drawn and pale, but now there was a sense of urgency in his eyes, a frantic energy that sent a chill down Eric's spine. "We have to get out of here," Talon said, his voice low and trembling. "This place, it's not what it seems. The experiments, they're not just on the hybrids. They're on us too. Our minds, our consciousness. They're manipulating everything. They're controlling us, Eric's." Eric's felt a wave of nausea roll over him. Talon's words were like ice water in his veins, but a part of him knew it was true. He had felt it, the strange disorientation, the fog creeping into his thoughts, the way time seemed to stretch and bend in this place. The walls were closing in, and Eric's could feel himself slipping, his grip on reality slipping further away with each passing moment. "The hybrids, they're not just subjects," Talon continued, his eyes wide with fear. "They're more than that. They're connected to this place, to this experiment. They're alive in a way we don't understand. And they're waking up. They're starting to realize what they are, what they've become." Eric's listened in horrified silence, his mind racing. The outpost was experimenting on more than just alien life forms. It was experimenting on human minds, on their very essence. What had they done to him? What had they done to everyone here? "We need to escape, Eric's," Talon said again, his voice strained. "They're watching us. We're not safe here." The fear in Talon's voice was contagious, and for the first time, Eric's felt a real sense of urgency. He had to get out. He had to leave before it was too late. The two of them made plans to escape that night, under the cover of darkness, when the outpost was quiet and the staff was preoccupied with whatever experiments they were conducting. Eric's heart raced as they crept through the hallways, the sound of their footsteps muffled by the thick, oppressive silence. Every corner they turned felt like another step into the unknown, another step into danger. But when they reached the exit, when they were almost free, Eric's stomach dropped. The door, the one they had seen as their way out, was locked. The alarm system blared to life, the red lights flashing above them, casting an eerie glow on the hallway. Eric's breath caught in his throat as he turned to Talon, only to see the other man's face pale with realization. "We're trapped," Talon whispered, his voice shaking. "We can't get out." And then, from behind them, there was a sound, a slow, deliberate click of boots against the floor, steady and unyielding. They weren't alone. Zyra Kaln stepped into view, her expression cold, her eyes hard. She moved toward them slowly, the sharp lines of her face unreadable. "You don't understand, do you?" Zyra said, her voice low and chilling. "You've always been part of the experiment, Eric's." Eric's blood ran cold. His mind raced, trying to comprehend what she was saying. What did she mean? "The outpost," Zyra continued, her voice almost amused. "It's all a simulation. You've been inside it this whole time. There is no escape. There never was." She smiled, and it was the kind of smile that sent shivers down Eric's spine. "You've always been a part of this. You always will be." And with that, the door behind them slammed shut, sealing them inside. The light flickered, and the walls seemed to pulse, breathing in time with Eric's rapid heartbeat. His mind spun, trying to process everything that had just been said. But it was too much. It was too much for him to grasp. Everything he had experienced, everything he had believed, was it all just a lie? Was he ever truly free? As the cold reality of Zyra's words settled in, Eric's felt the walls closing in tighter, the oppressive weight of the outpost pressing down on him. There was no escape. There never had been. And whatever had been done to him, whatever was happening to him, it was already too late. Eric's felt a cold numbness spread through him as the door to the holding chamber slid open, revealing Dr. Thaurix Vorn standing in the center of the sterile room. The cold, metal walls seemed to shrink around him, pressing in from all sides. Dr. Vorn's face was emotionless, almost robotic, as he glanced at Eric's with a strange sense of calm. But there was something behind his eyes, a dark glimmer of satisfaction that sent a chill down Eric's spine. "Do you understand now?" Dr. Vorn's voice was smooth, controlled, as if delivering a final lecture. "You were never meant to escape. You were never meant to be free." Eric's heart pounded in his chest as the truth hit him like a physical blow. He had been the subject all along, the final piece in a puzzle that had been unfolding around him, with each passing moment, each waking second. The experiments had never been about alien life forms or hybrids. They had been about him. "You're the perfect candidate, Eric's," Dr. Vorn continued, his voice now tinged with something darker, almost predatory. "Your curiosity, your mental strength, your willingness to endure. Everything about you made you ideal for the experiment. But what you don't know, what no one has told you, is the true purpose of this outpost." Eric's stomach twisted. He didn't want to hear it, but he couldn't look away. He had to know. "What are you talking about?" he managed to whisper, his throat dry. "The hybrids are not the end goal," Dr. Vorn explained, taking a step closer. "They're only the beginning. The aliens, they're learning how to transcend the limitations of human existence. They want to break free from the constraints of their own forms to become something more. And you, Eric's, you are the key to it all." Eric's breath caught in his throat. He didn't understand. How could he be the key? His mind raced, trying to process the weight of Vorn's words. His body felt heavy, as though the ground beneath him was giving way. "What do you mean?" Eric's voice trembled, the fear rising within him like a tidal wave. "What are you going to do to me?" Dr. Vorn didn't answer immediately. He simply stared at Eric's with those cold, calculating eyes. And then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he spoke again. "You're not just a subject, Eric's. You're the final subject. The one who will merge human consciousness with alien technology. The one who will become more than either. You will be the ultimate hybrid." The words hit Eric's like a physical blow, stealing the air from his lungs. His body went cold, his vision swimming as the realization settled into his mind. He wasn't just part of an experiment. He was the experiment. His mind, his body, His very essence were being used to create something that was neither human nor alien, a being that could exist in both worlds, a creature that would transcend them all. "No," Eric's gasped, shaking his head. "No, you can't," but it was too late. As Dr. Vorn stepped back, his hands moving to a panel on the wall, the room around Eric's began to shift. The walls hummed with a low, vibrating sound, and Eric's could feel a strange sensation coursing through him, something that was both familiar and alien at the same time. His skin began to prickle, his nerves screaming as a force he couldn't comprehend began to invade his body. He stumbled forward, his vision blurring. The pain was overwhelming, sharp and constant, as though his very cells were being torn apart and remade. His hands shook as he looked at them, watching in horror as the skin seemed to warp and stretch, the fingers elongating, the veins turning black and pulsating with an unnatural light. He opened his mouth to scream, but the sound that came out was a guttural, inhuman rasp. "No, this can't be happening," he thought, his mind struggling to hold onto some semblance of his former self. But it was slipping, his identity slipping away with each passing second, each agonizing moment. The boundaries of his humanity were breaking down, crumbling into dust, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. His vision began to fragment, images flickering in and out of focus. The lab around him twisted, becoming more alien, more surreal. The walls stretched, the ceiling seemed to warp, and he could hear voices, voices that weren't his own, but somehow familiar. They whispered, just out of reach, urging him to listen, to understand, to embrace what he was becoming. He reached out, his hand trembling as he tried to steady himself, but his fingers were no longer his own. They were different, longer, darker, more alien. He could feel the shift inside of him, the slow, terrible merging of his human consciousness with something far older, far more powerful. The alien technology, the hybrid DNA, it was all fusing together inside him, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. His thoughts were beginning to scatter, his memory fading, slipping away as the alien influence overpowered his mind. He could hear Dr. Vorn's voice again, distant but clear. "Your body is changing, Eric's. You will no longer be human. You will be the first of a new species, a new form of life capable of existing in both human and alien worlds." "No!" Eric screamed, or at least he tried to. The words were nothing more than a distorted growl, a sound from a throat that was no longer fully his. He staggered backward, but his body felt wrong, heavy, out of control. The sensation of being trapped inside his own skin, unable to escape, was unbearable. And then, as if the walls themselves were closing in, the truth hit him fully. There was no escape. The Outpost wasn't just a research facility. It wasn't just a place for experimentation. It was a vessel, a ship. And Eric's, now more alien than human, was its final creation. The aliens had succeeded. They had transcended their own form, and Eric's had become their perfect hybrid, the key to everything they needed. He wasn't a prisoner. He wasn't a subject. He was the experiment, and now he was the future. As the Outpost's walls hummed with an unfamiliar, alien energy, Eric's understood what he had become. He was no longer just Eric's Vale. He was the ultimate hybrid, a being who could cross the boundaries between human and alien, forever trapped in a body that was neither fully one nor the other. And there would be no escape, not for him, not for anyone. The final twist, the cruel irony, was that Eric's had never been a part of the Outpost's research. He had been the goal all along. He was the final experiment, the last step in a plan that would change everything, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. Eric stood alone in the control room, staring out of the large window. His body felt wrong, heavy, alien, like it was no longer his own. His reflection in the glass was a strange mix of human and something else, something far darker. His skin had taken on a silvery hue, smooth and unnatural, and his eyes glowed faintly with an otherworldly light. He barely recognized the face staring back at him. He wasn't the same person he used to be. Behind him, the door slid open with a soft hiss, and Saren Vaylor, the Outpost overseer, stepped inside. The tall, thin figure walked toward Eric's with a sense of purpose, but there was something in the way he moved, too calculated, too cold, that made Eric's pulse quicken. Saren's gaze was sharp as he stopped a few feet away, his eyes locked onto Eric's. "You've changed," Saren said, his voice smooth but with an edge that sent a shiver through Eric's. "You're no longer a human. You've become something greater, something necessary for the next stage of evolution." Eric's wanted to speak, to ask questions, but his throat felt tight. His mind was clouded, thoughts slipping away like sand through his fingers. He could feel the alien presence inside him, growing stronger with each passing second. It wasn't just his body that had changed, his mind was being reshaped as well. His humanity, the very thing that made him who he was fading, replaced by something far more powerful and calculating. "You're the key," Saren continued, his voice cold as the metal walls around them. "This experiment, it's been a success. You're not just the first hybrid. You're the prototype, the bridge between humanity and the aliens. With your new form, you'll help us spread the new species, our species across Earth, then beyond. To the stars." Eric's felt a sickening twist in his stomach as the weight of Saren's words settled in. He wasn't just the subject of an experiment. He was the instrument of a terrible future. He was no longer human. His mind, his soul, had been altered. The alien intelligence within him was growing stronger every moment, pushing out his humanity like an invasive force, slowly but surely. "The Earth has no place for humans anymore," Saren said, his voice almost pitying. "The hybrids are the future. You are the future. The human race, it's obsolete." The words hit Eric's like a punch to the gut. He wanted to scream, to lash out, but something inside him stopped him. His body didn't respond the way it used to. His hands, which had once been his own, felt like they belonged to someone else. He couldn't even recognize the feeling of his own thoughts anymore. It was as though he was losing himself, fading away into something else, something that wasn't human. The realization crushed him. He wasn't just a victim of this experiment. He was part of it. He was now a hybrid, an abomination that would carry the alien species to Earth, to the stars. There would be no going back. There was no escape from what he had become. As the control room's lights flickered overhead, Eric's mind raced, desperately trying to hold onto whatever fragments of humanity remained. He thought of his old life, of who he used to be, but it felt distant now, like a dream that was slipping away with every passing moment. His memories, his emotions, everything that made him human, was being replaced by cold, alien logic. His mind was no longer his own. Saren's voice broke through the haze. "You'll continue the cycle, Eric's. You will become the harbinger of a new era. You'll help create more hybrids just like you. You'll spread the new species until there's nothing left of Earth but its memory." Eric's stomach churned. There was no fighting it. There was no escape. He was no longer a man. He was something else entirely. Something that didn't belong to Earth, something that would never belong anywhere again. He turned his gaze back to the window. Outside, the Earth was growing smaller, a fading blue marble against the infinite black of space. The vastness of the universe stretched out before him, and for the first time, Eric's felt the weight of his fate fully settle over him. He wasn't just leaving Earth. He was abandoning everything he had ever known, everything he had ever cared about. His humanity was gone, replaced by something far colder, far more distant. As the ship carried them farther from Earth, Eric's realized the truth. The invitation to the outpost had never been for him. It had always been for what he had become. He was never meant to be saved. He was meant to become the very thing that would destroy everything he had ever known. And in the silence of the control room, as the stars stretched out before him, Eric's understood that he was no longer the man who had stepped into the outpost all those months ago. He was something new, something beyond human. The last thought that crossed his mind was a chilling one. He was no longer a prisoner. He was the key to the future. A future where humanity no longer had a place. As the ship's engines hummed steadily, Eric stood in the cold, empty room, watching the Earth disappear from view. He was trapped in the endless expanse of space, and there was no going back. He was the hybrid, the first of many, and his fate was sealed.